Broadcasting from Orchard Park, New York,
and Boca Raton, Florida,
it's the Freight 360 podcast. From freight broker sales tips to sports talk, this podcast is all about helping you grow as a freight broker. We're your hosts, Nate Cross
and Benjamin Kowalski.
Let's talk freight. All right, welcome back for another episode of the Freight 360 podcast. We're up to 207 this week, and we're going to be talking about rates today. But first, if you're brand new here, make sure to check out all the other content. Go to our website, freight360.net, and you can get the whole library there. Leave a review, whether it's YouTube comments or wherever you're listening to your podcasts, and keep sharing us with all your friends in the industry. If you'd like to learn more about Freight 360 and our training, you can check out the Freight Broker Basics course. It's a full-length, self-paced course taught by Ben and myself, where we cover everything from how to start a brokerage to how to build up your book of business, build carrier relationships, and even hire the right employees. So make sure to check that out. This episode is brought to you by Blue Book Services. They are the resource you need if you're transporting fresh produce. Their online database contains thousands of companies throughout the produce industry supply chain. You can easily search their database to generate new sales leads. Blue Book's credit ratings can help you avoid companies with high credit risk, and their team can help resolve disputed loads. To learn more, go to producebluebook.com and click join today. That's producebluebook.com. All right, well, Ben, we have a special guest here with us today from another one of our sponsors, DAT. So Tamir Dov, product manager at DAT. Tamir, welcome to the show, man. How are you?
Thanks, Nate. I'm doing well.
Good. Well, hey, so we've never had you on the show before, so most folks probably don't know who you are or what a product manager at DAT is or does. So feel free, just kind of give us a quick rundown on what you do with DAT and what your focus has been and maybe how you got started with everything.
Yeah, so I am the product manager for RateView and RateCast, which is our rate forecasting product. Basically, what I do is guide the direction of the development of our products. So if you're using RateView and you see any changes to what we're doing and how we're doing it, that is kind of happening at my direction. I've been at DAT for 5 years. Prior to being a product manager, I worked on our data science and analytics teams. I'm coming from an analytics background. So really what appealed to me about DAT is the rate database we have. Right now, we're closing in on $150 billion in transactions that we've collected over this year. And that's what's powering all of the rate information that you see in our products.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure Ben and I are going to both pick your brain on a lot of that stuff today because we get questions on it from listeners, and we also, probably have our own questions. But we're glad to have you, Tamir. Ben, how are you doing, man? You're in Florida. There's a hurricane coming through right now. You're probably not getting hit by that, but what's going on?
No, we got lucky. It came through past us last night. So, huge winds, but a little bit of rain. Same thing right now. Like, it's really, really, actually, it's raining and windy right now, but it's like the bands of the hurricane are kind of barely hitting us. So, all good for the most part. Didn't even really have to bring in all of our furniture, but definitely made landfall north.
We clearly have different weather issues being in New York versus Florida. I'm wearing a hoodie in August. So there you go. That's Buffalo for you.
Yeah.
Hey, on a note of sports, I didn't really have much this week. It's out, we got the week before football is going to start. It's kind of like that week off, but did you see Deion Sanders? He's coaching Colorado, the Colorado Buffaloes, the NCAA football program.
I saw that it was maybe going to happen, but I didn't know that it did.
Yeah. And I saw this thing on ESPN. They boosted ticket sales by like over 1,000% because he took over as coach. And it was pretty wild. Tamir, are you a college football, any kind of sports guy at all, or just super into data and numbers?
I'm a little bit into college football. I went to Oregon State, so I'm sort of bummed out about the conference restructuring, but we'll see how it goes.
Fair enough. So yeah, that's the Deion Sanders thing. The other thing, Ben, I know we've talked sport or golf, right? So the Ryder Cup, that's, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's like the team one, right? Where they play as a group, and the whole thing was like, if you went to live golf, you could not play in the Ryder Cup, right?
That was supposed to be one of the threats, apparently. But yeah, Brooks is the only live golfer that
Brooks
is.
Koepka, yeah.
Well, and the crazier thing too, and I read this further, was that like he only played in the majors, and he actually almost, I mean, considerably, like kind of finished well enough, even only playing in 4 majors to actually kind of qualify. Because again, it was only 4 tournaments, but he did well enough that, like, again, it says finished 7th in U.S. standings despite only being eligible to earn points in the major championships. After a frustrating 22 was derailed, Koepka won the PGA for his 5th career title, tied for 2nd at the Masters, where he held a 54-hole lead, and placed inside the top 20 at the U.S. Open. So had a
And
great.
in your own words, not mine, he has a punchable face.
That he does. The other news too was that Justin Thomas, I mean, he missed the cut actually for the FedEx tournament and did make the Ryder Cup team, but he's been very, very good in team and match play. So he
Fair
also
enough.
make the team.
Well, let's move on to some news here. Clearly, we mentioned the hurricane before. So you have wildfires in Hawaii that we just had happen earlier this month, and now we mentioned hurricane seasons here. I would say Hurricane Idalia, I think is how you pronounce it, is probably the biggest major hurricane to make landfall. I know there was Hurricane Hillary that hit California recently, but so you got FEMA working on 2 disasters right now, and the big takeaway is that these are, I mean, they're terrible natural disasters, but when FEMA goes into action, there's work for freight brokers and for transportation companies. So the goods have to get delivered. This is why I always urge people, if you're going to do some work with FEMA, don't wait until the end of August or September to get set up. You should be doing that stuff well in advance, because hurricane season comes every single year in the late summer and into the fall. So
something noteworthy too, in addition to that, because again, I think everybody goes towards FEMA. It's the obvious one. They're the highest rates. They tend to move the market. But apart from FEMA, right, just take a step back. And for anyone, just think about what happens when a major storm comes through. And imagine what would happen if you were driving a truck, right? Well, we can clearly know they're coming before they get there, right? And I know that seems obvious, but what do you think all the drivers do, right? They're going to get out of where the storm is going to hit as soon as they can, and you're not going to have more carriers coming down until the storm has passed, right? So every one of these distributors and shippers that need to move their product, probably as of yesterday, right? If you're in that path, there's no capacity there. So not only do those orders not ship, the orders today don't ship, the orders tomorrow probably won't ship. And then on the other side, depending on how much damage or what's going on with the roads or the power situation, that might be days or even a week, even if you don't have FEMA involved. And all that disrupts all of the normal lanes, the normal carriers that move into the market and out of it. And anytime you have that disruption, it creates opportunities. Creates opportunities for brokers and carriers to help. And that's a great way to get your foot into a company that you've been prospecting that really does need your help, if you can get carriers into that area and you can actually help, not just, hey, I want to try to help. And again, those are some caveats.
So that was one of the questions we had in our Q&A section that we'll answer on the final mile, which you guys can hear on Tuesday of next week. But Ben just gave a pretty good description of high level what to expect when stuff like that happens. So
we're already seeing that reflected in our data as well. We run a forecast of market conditions, and we're seeing that inbound capacity tighten up, and it's projected to tighten up even more as we go into next week.
And hey, for people listening right now, we're recording on Wednesday as this hurricane it's literally still happening. It's moving through Florida and Georgia right now. So
7 hours ago, it made landfall.
Yeah.
Yep. So, I mean, real time.
So we're going to dig into that. I want to peel back the layers. And that's a great example of one to look at. The other thing in news, Mexican driver strike that was expected to happen this week was postponed. If you postpone a strike, does it just mean it's canceled? Or are they like, no, we're still going to strike, but maybe next week? I don't know. They were going to do like a planned 2-day strike, like 300,000 drivers. And it was all over issues like cargo theft, extortion, high costs, like all the stuff that you tend to see happen with the bad actors that are out there. But disaster averted. So, I mean, the discussion point, had there been a strike, could have then rolled into what happens with the freight that's expected to come cross-border and be picked up in places like El Paso and other cross-border cities. But disaster averted for now. Well, Ben, we don't have to give a full ad read for DAT since we have Tamir on, but what's the scoop on a free month?
Yeah, check out the show notes for a link for a free month as of now, and I think it'll be transitioning shortly to 10% off the whole year. But either way, it's a great deal. It's a great bargain. So if you're adding DAT to your network, use the show notes, support us at Freight 360.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think, Tamir, without further ado, I want to just pick up where you kind of already alluded to with the hurricane, right? So you said you're already seeing rates adjusted tightening up like that. Tell us a little bit about where this example specifically, right? A natural disaster. Where are you guys getting your projections from? I guess just like give us the rundown, because I'm always just imagining like rates came from historical stuff from the last few days, but we have a hurricane that's coming. It's going to be a big impact. So where does this data come from? What's the process look like to spit out some rates?
Sure. So there's a couple things in terms of like a weather event, like a hurricane, that we look at. And one of the biggest indicator is trends on our load board. So those don't go into a RateView rate. Rates, as you said, like those are calculated based on loads that have already moved in the market. You'll see the days back on any calculation. Like a 3-day rate will include any load that's gotten picked up in the past 3 days. But we also have a forecasting data set, RateCast, where we do a short-term 35-day forecast. And in addition to involving the past 5 years of rate history in that calculation, we also look at market conditions coming from the load board. Like, what are people posting? What loads are they posting? What trucks are they posting? Where to? Where are they going? And that goes into our forecast as another additional variable. So that's where you can see the effect of a weather event. To Ben's point, you're already going to see that affect how drivers and brokers are posting loads on the load board. What are they searching for? And that's where you see the effect of a weather event coming up. And then next week, you'll kind of see that rate impact on like the RateView rate if you go on to,
So that makes sense. Okay. So so RateView, obviously, for people that don't know, that's your flagship rating tool that people have had access to for years, right? It's looking at, depending on the amount of data in that data set, you might get a 3-day average, a 3-day rate average, a 7-day, a 15, 30, something like that, right? Whereas RateCast is fairly newer, part of the DAT 1 package, right? Or DAT IQ.
So RateCast is an add-on to RateView. We released that in the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic. So that's been around for a couple of years now.
Okay, gotcha. Very cool. But that's interesting though. So obviously, to predict rates out, you probably look at historical trends, but for a weather event, which is not the status quo for late August, right? And in that essence, you can look at how are your customers how are they acting, and that can kind of give you insight. So like if drivers are posting drivers trying to get the hell out of Florida, obviously, when a hurricane's about to come through, right? Yeah. That's going to be a good indicator. Whereas you're right, next week when the actual loads have been moved, you see everything that happened over the past week, then we'll actually have that data in RateView. So okay, so let's say it's not a weather event, right? How about just a standard? Let's shift from Florida to I don't know, Chicago, right? If I were to look at RateCast and see what to expect the next 35 days outbound Chicago, what are you guys putting into? Obviously, we know where the historical rates come from,
Sure.
but we'll hit on that in a minute too. But where does the data come from that predicts out the next month or so, and how accurate is it as well?
Yeah, so every day RateView is calculating new averages for a given lane out of Chicago, right? And over the past 5 years, we're going to have over 1,500 data points there of what happened on that lane. So that is the primary input that goes into our forecast calculation. And what we're forecasting is the rate view rate on a given day in the future. So we're basically predicting like rate view is going to say like $2.10 per mile a month and a half from now. And then we'll give you like a upper and lower bound, sort of a target for what we expect, where we expect rate view to be on that range. And that target is actually really, really useful because you'll see it vary from lane to lane, because some lanes are more volatile than others, some are harder to predict. So you can actually use the range that we're showing on our forecast as an indicator for what the volatility is on that lane. Some lanes have a small target, some lanes have a large target.
So obviously bigger range, more volatile.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
and vice versa. Okay. Gotcha. Now, how about accuracy? Have you guys, I mean, you've been running the product for a few years now.
Yeah.
What have you like? Is there a percentage wise you guys can target? Hey, we're accurate with 90 something percent up to X amount of days.
So it definitely varies depending on when in time you're looking. Like I said, we started RateCast early in 2020. If you were to look at our accuracy for April of 2020, it wasn't too great. But
I'm
overall, we've been averaging over 95% accuracy, and that means that 95% of the time, the rate view rate will fall within those error bars that we present.
Okay. Wow, that's really good. That's very impressive. And that's you can do it up to a year out, right?
Yes. So we have two models. We have a short-term 35-day forecast, and we have a long-term 52-week forecast. The short-term is the one that we also include our market conditions index as an additional variable. The long-term is just basically forecasting seasonal trends on a market for the next 52 weeks.
Does it take into account any market variables and as it relates to things that are happening outside of the data?
Not for our long-term forecast. That's only taking in rate history. So the nice thing about including market conditions in our short-term forecast is it sort of inherently takes those into account. Basically how we were talking before, right? We're not including any weather data, but you'll see the impact of a weather event or of a tariff, anything like that on the load board, and that will be integrated into the forecast calculation.
Got it.
Now, let me ask you this, because I've had people ask about rate view, right? If I'm looking at a projected rate and I've got, obviously you get a range on there too. What percent of data, like outlier data, is eliminated out of that? Because obviously you're going to have like the super cheap backhaul for a dude that wants to get home for his kid's soccer game, or the super expensive last minute Friday afternoon load that's got to go because a production line shut down.
Sure. So I can just talk like from the beginning, from when we receive data from customers, how it actually gets into a rate view rate, because I think this is super important to understanding what you're looking at when you actually go into the product. So we have a couple steps in the process. We'll receive all of the raw data from users, and we have an initial set of outlier exclusion tests that we run that are fairly straightforward. It'll be like, we're not going to accept any load with a total rate under $100. We're really just trying to eliminate like bad data in that first pass. After that initial outlier exclusion, we calculate just a straight average of the data on the lane and a standard deviation. And then we do sort of a statistical outlier exclusion of removing anything 2 standard deviations away from the mean.
That's right. I remember someone was telling us that. That rings a bell now. When that comes down to roughly, is it like 5%?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, assuming that it's normally distributed, that's what you would see. It's not going to be normally distributed, but that's about right in general. So once we get that cleaned up data set, removing all of the outliers, that's when we actually calculate a rate view rate. And what we're doing there is a weighted average. So we require a certain amount of data on a given lane. And what we call a lane is like origin, destination, and then the days back. So we'll start like the lowest level is a 3-day rate, 3-digit zip to 3-digit zip rate. We'll see if we have enough data to calculate a rate view rate. In general, it's 3 contributors and 8 loads that we need to calculate a rate. If we don't meet that minimum threshold, then we'll expand up to the next level in our sort of hierarchy of granularities, up to like a 7-day rate, 3-digit zip to 3-digit zip, and then like a 3-day rate, 3-digit zip to market, so on and so forth, until we find a granularity that gives us enough data to calculate a rate view rate.
Okay.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Can I ask you? Ben, go ahead.
I was just going to reiterate kind of what you said, right, for some listeners too, right? It's basically, if you've got a lane, and let's say it's a lane that there's not a lot of volume on in your example, right? I don't know, like I used to ship to like Sparks, Nevada. There's like, sometimes there's loads, sometimes there isn't, whatever, right? So you got a lane where there's not a lot of trucks, not a lot of activity. So rather than you show no rate at all, because let's say there's only 2 or 3 loads moved, you will widen the region, right? Or the demographics on the map to get enough transactions to give something. So when you go into RateView, sometimes you can't all the way go to a 3-day rate or a 3-digit zip. You'll see like an 8-day or a 7-day rate, or maybe even a larger, because you need more time to have more transactions or a larger section of the region of the where it's at to give you enough data to give a rate. Is that?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay. Because we get that question a lot, like, why can I only see a 3-day here? Why am I able to go here? Why can I get better here? And it's really just the volume of transactions that happen in the lanes that you're actually searching.
Right.
So I was going to ask, where does, like you say, your customers' data comes in raw? How are you guys getting data? Is it like voluntary people are contributing it, or where does that come from?
Yeah. And I mean, it really comes from the strength of our network. And this is one of the biggest things that DAT has going for it in the market. You know, we've been around for over 50 years now. RateView has been around for, I think, close to 15 years. And we've built up a contributor base with our customers. So initially, RateView was started with like a small consortium of brokers. I think there was 12 that agreed to kind of sign on, share their data, and for that sharing of data, get back rate information that we cleanse, aggregate, and feed back to customers. And we've just expanded that network over time. I haven't checked recently, but last time I looked, we were over 1,300 companies contributing to the RateView database. So, I mean, that's where I get that like $150 billion in freight spend. That's all coming from RateView customers and contributors who have agreed to share their data with us to strengthen the quality of the rate data we're returning to them.
And then how recent is the data? Is it like a daily or weekly upload?
It depends on the customer. We go for ideally daily contributions. You know, we have some that are on a weekly basis. For some of our like contract only customers where, you know, the freshness of the data isn't quite as important, we'll go to like bi-weekly. We try not to do monthly. There's very few that are on a monthly cadence. I think overall in our network, we average like contributions in less than 3 to 5 days. But a key point in terms of the freshness of data is it doesn't matter to us when data is submitted. It only matters when that load is picked up. So if you're submitting loads on a 5-day lag, like we don't include it necessarily in the 3, or we wouldn't include it in the 3-day rate. It's impossible to be included in the 3-day rate. So that's just one thing to note. There's no, like what you're seeing in that days back means all of the loads included were moved in that period.
Okay. Makes sense. So whether they've submitted it yesterday or last week, it's the data is attributed or contributes to the pickup date in which the load actually happened. Okay.
That's right.
Well, that makes sense. Interesting. Ben, what do you got?
I'm curious on some other things. One of the other questions we get a lot, right, is how do like posts from brokers, right, that are maybe for quotes affect any of the rates or any of the information we get back, right? Because lots of brokers are aware that like a lot of posts they see aren't real loads or multiple brokers working on the same load for the same customer, for example, right? Like how does that play into, or how does that, not really sure, like, because that's the
Yeah.
question we always get is like, where does this really go? Does this mean the market is really moving, or is this
I mean,
not real?
this is a question that we get a lot too. The answer in terms of rates is pretty simple. It doesn't have any effect. We're not including anything off of the load board. In terms of rates, we don't care until the load actually gets moved. Like that's our key date. So, you know, we often get questions on like the rates that are being posted on the load board and if those go into rates. They do not. The only place that load board data is at all included in like any of our rates is, like I said before, in the market conditions aspect of the forecast.
Got it. So yeah, that's where it's giving you whether this is a tight market, whether this is a loose market, or
Right.
loads to truck ratios. That is directly
Exactly.
derived from loads posted and trucks posted, correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm curious, and we've had Ken Adamo on in the past, and he would always kind of give us like trend wise what he predicts and sees. Now I'm curious, but he's like I would consider him like a market analysis kind of guy, or
Yeah.
I consider you like the computer scientist. I'm curious, like you're obviously a data guy. You don't have a freight background, which we didn't mention that, but we talked about it off air. So do you get like an inkling for where you think the market's going, and like big picture wise, not like, next week, but like we've seen the rates gone down the last year or so. And if I look at like the national rate view, like I'll just pick van for example, it looks like we kind of hit a bottom
Yeah.
a few months ago and maybe tick up a little bit, but kind of flat. Do you guys have any, I know you're more on the data side, but do you have any kind of like inkling what that indicates or where you think it might go?
Yeah. So in my previous role at DAT, before I moved into product, I was actually responsible for developing a lot of the market metrics that, Ken and others are tracking. So I'm a little bit like less involved in that now in the product role. But this was actually something that we've been predicting, that like we were going to see this bottoming out effect after that like long drop off we had through last year into this year. In terms of like what we're actually looking at moving forward, I mean, Ken is definitely like more on top of this than I am. I think I would like probably defer to him a little bit, but it seems like we're seeing more of that like evening out and maybe like a return to more of the seasonal behavior that we would expect to see moving into like Q4, a lot of like the Pacific Northwest.
That's interesting because that's in line with what we've heard. Like we had Dean Croak on, and that was like earlier this year, like I think February, and we asked him, and he's very in tune with what's going on in the market, and he's like, I bet Q3 will hit a soft bottom, and then we'll crawl back out in Q4 when we get to peak season. It's like pretty much to a T, that's what the market has done nationwide.
And I'll say to both those points, Dean's article that he released Sunday is the interview with conversation between Dean, Ken, and Jason Miller. And Jason Miller puts out a lot of market data as well. And they were talking about exactly this. Ken, I think, had said the prediction that he had as of like literally when this conversation, like a few days ago, was first quarter, like right after the lull of kind of like the New Year's lull, that somewhere in mid first quarter, he sees the pickup. Jason predicted he thinks it's maybe a little closer to Q2. And then they both kind of argued, like Ken actually asked Jason in the article and says, and this will be up on DAT's site too, I think next week, but said, well, what is the discrepancy between Q2 and Q1? And Jason basically said, he's like, look, trying to guess this is like, damn near impossible. He's like, I hate to give an exact date. He's like, but basically we're saying the same things. I'm just being a little more conservative than kind of Ken was. And Ken was leaning into the Ratecast data, and he had said him and Dean think that it is, again, earlier into next year, like right around January, February, end of January, kind of February, where Jason said maybe it's a little closer to when the housing start picking up for spring. Q2.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I still think you're going to see your seasonal tick up this year as we get to peak season towards like Thanksgiving and Christmas. And that's just seasonality, right?
For
The
sure.
market as a whole has been on a decline just simply for the fact of there's not as much freight out there as there was for all the available capacity. And
Here's
I
something.
think with all the closures of companies, I think that's where it's kind of started to even out. What do you got, Ben?
Two things too, and I want to lead this into the next question too, which is the other thing I saw recently is the tender rejections per freight waves are at like a 6-month high. I saw like a day or two ago. There was an article that they put out. I think it was referenced in Reuters because they were talking about exactly the inventory levels in retail going into Q4 and the import volumes coming up. And both of them had said, in the same way that the rejections are going up. Well, this is anecdotal and this is in no way seen in the data, but I can't tell you how many people I've talked to in the past few weeks, at least a half a dozen to a dozen brokers and carriers that are seeing more volumes become available. At the same time, I have talked to shippers who have flat out told me, and customers and people I've worked with, that like they're pushing their bids below rates that they know they won't get capacity in the long term, right? Like they are doing whatever they can to try to squeeze whatever they can out while they can. And what's happening, what it seems like is if both of those things are true, you can only push rates so far before carriers start rejecting loads, right? And again, everybody plays the game and will submit rates, and a shipper can say, hey, my target rate is 10% below the lowest thing that anyone submitted to me. And people will respond and they'll still submit rates. The reality is when that load needs picked up, nobody shows up. And all of a sudden, these loads start moving from the contract market to the spot market, which is what hasn't happened really since the peak of the pandemic. The contract market went up, the spot market kind of disappeared, and we need the rejections in the contract loads to move to the spot, to pick the spot market up. And it seems like it's starting to happen in some areas. I don't know if it'll be consistent enough to move the whole market, but it seems like it is in some instances.
I want to give a shout out to another sponsor of ours before we get to the second half here of the conversation. When it comes to hiring, is your freight brokerage hiring? If so, you got to check out Lean Solutions Group, the industry leader in nearshore staffing for logistics companies with offices in South America, Mexico, and the Philippines. They offer a wide range of roles from back office operations to web development and marketing. Partner with the best. Visit www.leangroup.com to learn more. That's leangroup.com. All right, Ben, back to what you were saying. I had to squeeze that in there for Lean, but you make a good point. We've been tracking this for like over a year now, right? The spot contract.
And they're getting closer. And that's what I was going to ask. And that was going to lead into like, are you seeing the convergence of contract versus spot? Are they getting closer? Where do you feel? And again, what are your thoughts on kind of this inversion point, or like how this is going to play into even utilizing the tools for RFPs, right? And bids, because that's where I was kind of going with it.
Yeah, so we are seeing spot and contract rates start to converge. There's still like a fairly, healthy gap. Like they're not that close to flipping at the moment. But it's definitely something to track, is like what you're saying kind of comes to fruition. If we hit sort of a breaking point where that contract rate drops below the spot rate, that's usually a really strong indicator of something changing in the market.
The other thing I wanted to ask too, because those are the two big rates you can look at, is broker to carrier spot and then the shipper to carrier contract. So back to where your data comes from, are your carriers providing data, or is it shippers providing data, or is it both? Because I know to DAT account, you could be a shipper and have an account. Where does that data come from? Does that come from carriers or shippers or both?
They say it. Yeah. How do you determine?
Our data is almost entirely coming from brokers and shippers. That mix has moved more towards shippers than it has been in the past. We're still majority brokers, but I believe we're closing in on like 30 to 40% of our contributions coming from shippers. One of the reasons that we don't necessarily prioritize the carrier-based contribution is we would increase the risk of duplication. If we're getting the same load from a shipper side and a carrier
Yes.
side, that would not be
Okay.
ideal for the database.
Yeah. No, I didn't even think about that. Yeah. Makes total sense.
And for our audience, can you explain too, in like layman's terms, the difference between broker to like the contract rate, the spot rate, and how fuel plays into one and not the other, and like how that is read from somebody that is like, okay, I see two lines. One says shipper to carrier, one says broker to carrier. It includes fuel, but like, why are these so different? And why is there the fuel subtraction? Like how does somebody understand what they're seeing when they look at this?
So we end up calculating both of our rates more or less the same. It's just like where fuel comes out of it in the process. But in terms of like what is the actual difference between the spot and contract rate, so there's a couple different ways you can arrive at the distinction. Like generally, like a spot rate is going to be set on like a one-off basis. A contract rate is going to be repeated on a regular cadence, right? So DAT for RateView has made the decision to use our contributors coding on that to differentiate. So we basically like ask our contributors, is this a spot or contract load? And that's how it falls into one of the two categories. We've actually looked at in the past, like if we can define spot or contract based on rates. And we do that basically by looking for repetition in our contributions. Like, does this rate show up repeatedly? And then we've compared it one-to-one to see like what is the difference if we decide if it's spot or contract versus our contributors decide. And the difference between that, like 90% of the time they match. So there was disagreement on like 10% of those loads where like the coding from our contributors didn't match the algorithmic results. So, yes. I mean, that's actually like fairly good in terms of like false positive rate. But that's what's going into the distinction. It's actually like, what do our contributors say on which one is spot or contract?
And I want to give an example too, like where I first learned this, right? So like I worked at a big brokerage and I remember like the first place we would look, right? Because again, they were large enough that we had lots of lane data, lots of lane history, right? And we always kind of taught you look in two places, right? First, look at what we as an organization have been paying. That's probably closer than maybe the entire market, right? Because you got relationships and things that are all built into that. If you're going to the market, you have less of those. So you look at both, but you understand what they are. And I remember one of the first lanes I was looking at, right? We'll just call it like, I don't know, like New Jersey to Atlanta, right? And I looked and one broker, right, is paying, we'll say like $1,100 on every one. But then another account and another broker and another office is paying 15 to 19, and it's wildly changing, right? And you couldn't tell when you looked at the system other than that, like they just were off. But like one broker seems like it's the same all the time, and it's way lower than the other. Yep. And the only way we could figure this out was we were like taught, call the broker, ask them or their assistant if they can give you some insight into what's going on here. And almost every single time you found the two different categories, right? One was the carrier, the customer didn't really need their freight picked up on a certain day. They were more rate sensitive and they could move the days on their loads. So like, for instance, you might be shipping scrap for somebody and it was like, well, my customer, and this is what the broker would say, my customer's like, look, I just want to stay at this rate. When you get me a truck, let me know. I'll give you the load and we'll move it. So the rate stays the same and it operates like contract, right? The carrier changes, but for the broker and the shipper, the rate's never changing, right? Which is kind of what we're saying, like you see the similarities in data, right?
Yeah. And you keyed in on, I think, the most important point, and something like if there's one takeaway I want people to get from this, you said it, which is like understanding your own data and the relationship to DAT. And that is super key because RateView, like all of our rates, are giving you a market average for what we would consider like a normal load on a lane.
Yep.
And then a range. So we give you that like interquartile range of the 25th to 75th percentile. So that's where half of the data on that lane fell. And something I hear from customers is, I'll have someone come up to me and be like, hey, your rates are wrong. Like I'm always $200 below rate view.
Yeah.
That's something I hear all the time. And if you're always $200 below the rate,
Then it's
then
good data.
RateView is working perfectly for
Yes,
you.
it's good
right?
data.
Or consistency.
It's consistent.
It's
Yeah.
consistent, but it's all about your relationship to that RateView rate and understanding where you fall in the distribution of loads on a lane.
Right.
Let
And
me,
I want to
ask this. So you just mentioned 25th and 75th percentile. So if I'm looking at like I just pulled up a lane, I pulled up a random Florida to New York, and you've got the dot in the middle that shows a number, and then there's a range below it and above it. Is that so that range is what percentile or I guess.
So it's called an interquartile range. So if you were to look at the whole distribution of rates that we use for the RateView rate on the lane, there's going to be the bottom 25%, and there's going to be the top 25%, and then the middle 50%. And that middle 50% is what we present to you in RateView. So what you're looking at is the range where half of the data is falling around that average. And it's really important. Like you can learn a lot from looking at those values. Like the particular lane, like I'm looking at Spokane to Denver, and the range is $1.78 to $2.10, and the average is $1.90. So you have 12 cents below and 20 cents above, right? So there's a skew to that distribution. And that indicates that more of the data is spread out above. Like there's a higher range of values above the average than below the average. And you can start to learn a lot about how people are moving freight and at what rate you can expect to see by assessing that range.
That's interesting. The lane I pulled up was Tallahassee, Florida to Buffalo, New York. And obviously people we're in the last week, probably trying to get out of Tallahassee. So it shows 171 is the average, and it only goes up 1 penny to 172.
Everybody's trying to get out
down to $1.43. So a lot of the data is falling below that, clearly, because they're like, "Let me get out of here."
That's telling you a ton about what's going on that lane just by looking at where the average falls in that range.
The other thing too, and I want to talk through this for our listeners too, because I think it's helpful in this topic, right? Is it's the relation, right, of time versus rate, right? And they are different. And like we always kind of say, you're either going to get a rate or a date if you go to the extreme, right? Like if you give me a rate and I got to stick at this, then you got to give me enough time to make it work. If you're going to give me a date, then I need flexibility on rates if you want a good quality carrier, we'll say, right? Because those things are all subjective a bit, right? Yeah. And if you're in a scenario, right, where let's say, I don't know, it's 3:51. My customer calls me now and I got to get a truck in there in the next hour and a half, we'll say, before their window closes, right? You've got a much smaller amount of trucks. Which means
you're not going to go to RateView and try to quote them based off of
exactly.
average.
And that's really where I think people that are new don't get this, right? Like they go to RateView and they're like, well, this is the average. This is what I should pay this afternoon. And the reality is like that RateView is a tool for me that's like, if you're trying to get a range for what you're going to pay tomorrow, the next day, or over the next week, if you've got to move something this afternoon or in the next few hours, I always suggest you go to the market. Look at the number of trucks posted, for one, to get an idea of how many people are even available. And then two, I look at the loads available and go, what is the most somebody's paying right now? And what are the criteria of that load? Because that is a whole other thing. You could have a 44,000 pound load. Somebody could have a 20,000 pound load. They will be priced differently, right? But if all things are equal, right? Like when you look at the market, to me, that gives me a better insight into what I'm likely to pay in the next few hours as opposed to RateView. Is there anything we can say as related to like somebody that is going to do this? They're a new broker. Like, I got a load to pick up this afternoon. Where do I go, right? And why do I go there?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on with the direction you're headed. Just like one last part on RateView that we were talking about. What we're showing is that interquartile range, which means half of the data we collected fell outside of that range, either above or below, so it's not a minimum and maximum of what you can expect to pay. And in the situation you're talking about, more than likely, you're not going to be in the middle 50%. You're going to be on the extremes. So I think that's super important to note. There's a couple aspects that you can really start to see the full range. Like we'll report to you the the raw standard deviation that we use for our initial outlier exclusion if you do like a multi-lane download or access our data through the API. And if you just take that standard deviation, it's not going to be perfect, but you can look at that standard deviation in combination with the average and get more or less a true range of values on that lane.
Yes.
Right? Anything within two standard deviations of the rate view average is basically going to be like every load that's not, like a Teams hazmat expedited. Like that's going to give you a really good true range of where you want to be for a load that's picking up in a couple hours.
So two questions, right? One is, I mean, your background as a data scientist, for the layman out there in 101 level, right? Like as Nate would say, like Barney style, explain standard deviation for everyone out there that hasn't had stats.
Oh, we're going back to stats class.
All right, great. So
bell curve.
Standard deviation is just a measure of variability on a lane. If I was to have like 100 loads that moved on a lane with a standard deviation of 0, that means they all moved for the exact same rate. They were all $1,000, right? As there's becomes more variability, like let's say one load out of the 100 moved at $1,100, you're going to see that standard deviation go up. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to do that math.
You don't have to do public math. No,
yeah,
just working through the concepts.
If you were to see something where none of those rates were the same, and there's a big range from like $500 to $3,000, you're going to see a much larger standard deviation to capture all of the possible values in that data set.
Yep.
So that's really where it comes down to, where like if I was to see a standard deviation that's like the same size as the average on a lane, that means like we're getting a lot of variability here. If the standard deviation is like 10% of the average, then it's fairly consistent. So you can use that kind of like as a back of the napkin indicator for like variability.
The way I first conceptualized this one, somebody taught me, it was like, I think it was a professor explained it. He was like, think of like a shotgun. Like if you're really close to your target, all of these beads are really tight. Your standard deviation is very small. If you shoot that same target from farther away, the scatter group gets bigger, your standard deviation gets wider, right? It's just the data points and how far they are from each other. The closer they are, the smaller the number is. And the bell curve is the mathematical.
I was going to say, Ben, I always thought the same example, but instead of being closer or further away, it's just the choke that you put on the shotgun to get a tight shot group versus a wider spread. So there you go. We've done both a statistics lesson and related it to shooting guns and freight all within one conversation.
Well, and I think I wanted to go one more with that, right? Because we didn't really cover kind of like the RFP tool and how people can do this. Because this is another question we get a lot of, like, what happens when my customer sends me a routing guide and there's 100 or 1,000 lanes on this? Like, what do I do? Do I bid all of them? Do I have to upload them? Like, what can I do and what tools are available for somebody in this scenario?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my team has been responsible for developing DAT's RFP tool. And primarily what we do there is we leverage our forecast data. So we talk to a lot of our customers, and what a lot of our customers were doing to respond and bid on an RFP was just going into our multi-lane download, getting rate view rates for today across all their lanes, maybe adding a margin on there, making maybe some adjustments, maybe just taking those rates and moving forward and just kind of putting them in and seeing what happens, which is like fine. But, we have a couple things that can improve that process and make it a little more accurate. So what we did in the RFP tool is we are working on bringing a lot of our forecast data together, and in the future, allowing users to blend that with their own data, which is where I think it becomes really powerful. Where if you're doing like a bid for Q1 of next year, you can take our ratecast forecast over that 3-month period, which is going to give you a better indication of where rates will be than taking today's rate view rate, and then combine it with like all of your own data on what you've been paying on that lane in the recent past, and kind of blend those, doing a weighted average of the two to arrive at like a line haul rate, and then add on margin, anything else from there.
That's impressive. Is
So
there
yeah,
any other tool that's out there that does rate projections to that caliber, where you can blend the two together and weight them? I remember seeing that
yeah.
from your team, the DAT team, earlier this year before DAT 1 had the upgrade. But I don't know of any other like quoting tool. Obviously, we know there's rate tools out there, but where you
Yeah.
can blend together and have a weighted average of what goes into what and add a margin to spit out an
I'm not
RFP bid for you.
aware of anything definitely not aware of anything that uses like a rate forecast as part of that process. I know there's some companies doing like similar things, and I don't want to speak directly about like what they're doing.
Sure, yeah. But yeah, I mean, either way, that's awesome. That's good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, cool. So I guess to kind of recap here, make sure I remember all of this. So your data is coming from actual customers, whether they are brokers or shippers of DAT, and it's based off of the shipment date, right? So if it's a 7-day average, it's any load that picked up in the last 7 days. Okay. You're excluding outliers that have too low of a price, like $100, and you're excluding
Or too high.
outside of 2 standard deviations. And then what you were seeing in the actual rate view is the middle 50%. Is that
Right.
correct? Okay.
Yep.
People always ask me, like,
Yeah.
what's in that? Where does that range come from? Now anyone listening knows now, and now we can reiterate.
And these are not maxes and minimums, right? I'm going to reiterate what he said, right? Like, I think that's what a lot of people see when they first get into it. Like, that is not the least you'll pay or the most, right? Like, that is the bulk of the or actually half of the transactions, basically, with the top 25 and the bottom 25 being excluded, right? So it's giving you a range. And if you keep saying that your rates are consistently above or below, that should be happening because you either have an advantage or a disadvantage with your carriers or lack of carriers relationship, right? And maybe you're on the other side.
Unless you just have like the most basic average load on the lane, you shouldn't necessarily expect to be like right on the dot of the rate view average.
Can I ask you something too before we finish the recap? And this is something else I had in my head and I wanted to get across is like, do you do anything related to like when somebody is trying to secure a load on the spot side versus when it was secure and the time factoring into like the actual rate? If that makes sense.
Lead time, basically.
Yes.
So not in rate view, but we do have something coming for rates that is going to use lead time because it is impactful. Like your lead time of like, how long from when a rate was negotiated to the pickup date is a key factor in where that rate actually falls. So we're working on something right now. It should be coming in the next year that does like a modeled rate projection that is going to include the impact of things like lead time on rates.
That's good.
I want to say something out there, right, for everyone listening too. Is that like what we were taught was like, if you're covering a load 3 or 4 days in advance, you got a high likelihood that truck will find a better load before then, and you got a pretty high likelihood of fallout. Now, you try to cover it the day before, you're getting closer to probably the best rate you'll pay, right, or the lowest rate. But if you wait until the day of, which is far riskier, right, just like everything else in life, the more risk you take, the more reward there is. You can usually grab a carrier that really does need it and you can pay a little less, right? So the equivalent was you pay less 3 or 4 days. As you get closer, you might pay a little more, but then the day of, you usually also pay less, where it's kind of like this curve. And I was like, that'd be awesome to be able to see the data and how that actually plays. Because I'm sure there's differences in lanes based on volume of freight and trucks too. So
yeah,
that's going to be an awesome product.
And capacity is going to have a huge impact on how that lead time actually affects the rate as well.
That's awesome.
Interesting. All right, so to continue the recap here, so rate view is not your high and low range. It is the middle 50%. Rate cast takes into account other variables such as like your short range one is going to take into account how your customers are acting right now. as well as 5 years of historical data and how things have gone. And it's accurate 95%, that the projected range is where the rate view will fall on that day. So, man, this is this is a different kind of episode for us. We're doing all kinds of statistics and very different.
I want to point out too, right? That's something you pointed out, is that like knowing what you're getting in statistics and data and rates is really important in being able to determine what to do with it, right? Like, should I be above this? Would I be below this, right? To your point, like if you have a very average shipment, right? Can you give an example of what an average load looks like that you would expect to be in the middle?
I mean, you're probably going to do a better job.
I'd call it 42,000 pound van load, right? With one pick, one drop, with
Chicago,
like no weird requirement. Yeah.
In the middle of the week.
Right.
No weather in June.
I was even just thinking like the things that go into the load. And again, if you've got, you need an overweight permit, if you got any weird requirements, that's going to push your rates above these bounds. And on the other end, if you've got a very light load that is much easier to move, but you still need to ship it dedicated. Yeah, or a partial load, you're going to be on the lower end and probably outside of the ranges you see in RateView, right? So for anyone out there, when you've got very specialized, very specific needs where there's less of those out there, you're probably outside the bounds on the top end. And the same concept on the other end.
Yeah, I mean, RateView is a great tool for pricing, but it's just a tool that you can use to arrive at a price, and it's really only going to be as good as how you use it and what you're bringing to the table to leverage it. And that's really key. Like, it starts with understanding what we're presenting and then using that along with understanding your own business and what you're trying to do.
That's what I've always loved and hated about stats. You can basically use any of them to justify anything with the right rationale, but if you ask enough questions, you can find out what it really means, right? It's just, are you going to put the time and effort into understanding what it really is that it's saying?
Yeah.
Good stuff. All right. Tamir Dov with DAT. He's the man, the myth, the legend behind RateView, RateCat, pretty much any of the data stuff over there. I might be giving you more credit than you actually deserve, for all I know. But you've expanded my my knowledge base today for sure on rates and what goes into it and all that stuff. So we appreciate you coming on, and hope to get you on in the future too, and talk about some of the new stuff that may be coming out down the road. So
that'll be great.
Good deal. Ben, any final thoughts here before we wrap it up?
Whether you believe you can or believe you can't, you're right.
And until next time, go Bills. That wraps up this episode of Freight 360. Check out the show notes for links to anything that we've referenced on this episode. And make sure to visit us online at freight360.net to see our entire library of episodes, videos, blogs, and more.
And make sure to check us out on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel for daily and weekly tips and content. And if you'd like your question answered on the show, fill out the Contact Us form on our site, and we'll see you next week.